Well, good morning. Welcome to the panel on Afghanistan and human rights issues. My name is Mahmoud Moshipuri. I teach international relations at San Francisco State. And I'm also a lecturer at global studies at the University of California at Berkeley. I have the honor of moderating this session. We have 5 speakers, and I've asked them to confine their remarks to no more than 10 minutes. We are going to introduce them one at a time, and we will have plenty of time left for Q&A session afterwards. I'd like to thank American Political Science Association, especially the Human Rights section, who actually they have sponsored this webinar. I'm very grateful to you. More specifically, I'm grateful to Lennon Lowry from APSONet, who has helped us to work all technicalities surrounding this webinar. Also, Andreda Castillo from University of California at Irvine, which has also helped us to advertise this event. First and foremost, I am grateful to Professor Zahra Arad, who has really been effortless in terms of, working on this panel, putting it together, and spending time, energy, and effort. She talked to me about putting this panel together. For the last 4 or 5 months, she has been working on that. We are all grateful, Zahra, for your time, for your effort, and for your determination and unwavering commitment to put this panel together. We are grateful. Let me start with the first speaker, and we'll take it from there. Our first speaker today is Professor Nazif Shahrani. He is a professor of anthropology, Central Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. Professor Shahrani is an Afghan American anthropologist with extensive field research in Afghanistan and has studied Afghan refugee communities in Pakistan and Turkey. Professor Shahrani, podium is yours.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good morning to everybody, and thank you, Professor Arad and Professor Manshipur, for organizing this panel and inviting me to be part of it. We really appreciate it, and also, of course, your sponsors, the American Political Science Association, for helping this effort. What I would like to discuss briefly, it's not a subject that could be done in 10 minutes, but we'll try. And that is a fundamental breach of human rights in Afghanistan and a lot of surrounding countries, and that is the breach of the rights of citizenship in these societies. The problem, of course, is in these countries, especially Afghanistan, we only have rulers and subjects, no government officials and citizens as such. In fact, in the vernacular, even in the constitution of Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan are referred to as taba'a or ra'ya, which are both Arabic words, and they translate into subject, not citizen. We do not actually have a word yet constructed. There is one Iranian word, shaharwand, but there are objections on the part of rulers of Afghanistan. In fact, I had a conversation with President Karzai when the 2004 constitution was being drafted. I reminded him that there is a chapter in the constitution that says huquqi at-taba, which means the rights of subjects, and it is an oxymoron. Subjects do not have rights. And I asked him at that time, why not use alternative words? And he said, well, there isn't one. I said, what about Shaharwan? He said, well, it's foreign, it's Iranian. We don't want that. I said, why don't you construct one in Pashto or Persian, or come up with one that is equivalent of citizen or Shaharwan? He did not. Let me just explain why this is the case. I think it's part of Afghanistan's very dysfunctional political culture. And the political culture of Afghanistan, and I want to summarize that, has 4 legs, 4 parts, 4 elements. And that these are, in fact, together responsible for the non-recognition of the right of citizenship in our society. And that these four legs of the dysfunctional political culture of Afghanistan is the notion of kingship, that is, absolute rights of an individual to rule over the country, and that this has resulted in person-centered politics and selfish politics and small group politics, whether it's ideological or kin-based in terms of tribe and so on and so forth. And it has resulted in the politics of exclusion. And that's a very serious matter and can be discussed a lot more. The second element of Afghanistan's dysfunctional political culture is kinship, relying on kinship. Kingship and kinship are very closely related. Those who have been in the position of rule, they have relied essentially on nepotism because of deficit of trust in society. They have relied on their kinsmen. So nepotism is one of the elements, cronyism, and then of course followed by corruption. That these are all related to this element of political culture in the country. The third element is instrumental use of Islam. Islam is a religion, is not used as a guidance for human behavior, but is an instrument for mobilization on behalf of those who are in power, whether politically or the Ruhaniyun, the ones who are sort of shopkeepers of religion, who are making use of religion and in fact have turned to what Shariati used to call istihmari dini, that is making donkeys out of people in the name of religion, keeping them ignorant, keeping them out of understanding the Quran, and bringing in all sorts of nonsense in the name of religion, and then of course using that to their own advantage. The fourth element really is the most important one, and that is essentially dependency on foreign subsidies, in foreign money, foreign weapons. This has started from 1880 with the creation of Afghanistan as a buffer state between Tsarist Russia, British India, and that subsidies that were given to the first king of Afghanistan, Abdurrahman Khan, and let him loose essentially to whatever he wanted. And of course, he claimed that he was elected by God to be king of Afghanistan, not by the British who crowned him. So you can see that all of these person-centered politics and kingship, and abuse of Islam, all of them sort of come into being. What's the significance of this dependency? Since the rulers have been getting money and weapons from outsiders, they don't need to have popular legitimacy. And therefore, there is no need for relying on people to give them legitimacy, because they don't need it. They have the money, they have the weapons, they have the backing of the foreigners. And as a result, Afghanistan has always had rented regimes, not rentier regimes, which is popular, but rented regimes. These are literally regimes that have been working for outsiders who funded them and who kept them in power. And this is really the real reason for non-recognition of right of citizenship in the society. All these machinations we have had in the name of elections and so forth has been bogus. It doesn't make it, it has had no value, no significance, no importance. There has been no popular input whatsoever. That the over-centralization of power because of this money and weapon that comes from outside has essentially denied and made it impossible to have the rights of citizenship to come into being. So what could be done in terms of, I don't want to just put problems, but is there a way out of this which hasn't been given a chance to have the rights of citizenship? My suggestion consistently has been that we need to allow the principle of community self-governance in Afghanistan. And if we do not allow community self-governance without reference to tribe, ethnicity, and so forth, just people wherever they live, whatever the make of that population, whether it's rural areas, in the cities, that local population should have the right to elect their own political officers and to recruit their own professional staff. That's when they recruit people to serve them, they become citizens, and those who come to or elected or hired will become civil servants. That's the meaning of citizenship. And that's what we do not have, because in the past, the rulers have appointed everybody from top down all the way to the lowest levels, unfortunately. And when they have been appointed, they have gone as rulers. And they have treated people as taba'a, as subject in ra'yat, and not as shahwan. And that's the problem. So that we need to essentially get rid of the power of appointment from the center, and that all professional officers should be recruited through committees and commissions at the ministerial level, at the provincial level, at the district level, that they should have the right. And they should recruit without discrimination in reference to place of residence, without sectarian affiliation, tribal affiliation, ethnic affiliation. Any Afghan should be able to be recruited in any part of the country for whatever service that the local community needs. And that would, in fact, do something wonderful if we tried it, and that is depoliticization of identities. Afghanistan has a horrendous politicization of identities, politics, and of course we have these wheeler dealers of every tribe. Anyone who has any kind of power or access to power from any ethnic group. I'm not saying that it is restricted to one group, although the dominant, and these are not representatives of anybody. Rulers in Afghanistan have represented only outsiders, never their own people. So as such, I don't want to accuse the people who accuse this ethnic group or that ethnic group. The people who have done the ruling with the help of outsiders in the name of their own ethnic group, they have done no service to their own people. None. Right now, look at Taliban, look at the 20 years before that, and go back to the communist era, go to the monarchy era. It's the same pattern, the same thing, that we are essentially afflicted by these regimes that are rented by outsiders because of dependency, and that dependency has been increased over time and has become multiplied. Earlier it was uni-centered, now it is multi-centered. And that's really the tragedy of Afghanistan, for not allowing people to have a say in the political lives and making decisions about who governs them and who provides them service. And until and unless we reach that stage where people make decisions about who should be running the affairs, the administrative affairs of the country, we're not going to achieve citizenship. That is, we need to transform these subjects to becoming real citizens, real participants. And we have a very good constitution. The rights of the constitution, the current constitution of Afghanistan, is extremely well put together. We have problem with the executive structure of the constitution. It's that executive structure that needs to be decentralized with a principle of community self-governance. And I don't care about what you name it, whether it's a monarchy, whether it's republic, federal, none of those things matter. The only thing matters is the principle of communities having the right to make decisions and govern their own communities, something that we here in the United States are very well familiar. And virtually monarchies in Europe are also using the principle of community self-governance. Norway, Sweden, UK, Spain. So monarchy doesn't mean anything. You can have a monarch, but it's a rule of governance that's critical, and that's what's missing, and that's what needs to be changed in Afghanistan. Thank you very much. We can't hear you, Dr.
Mahmoud, you're mute.
Thank you, Professor Shahrani, for sharing your perspectives with us. Our next speaker is Susie Hansen. She's a journalist living in Istanbul and New York. Her first book, entitled Notes on a Foreign Country, An American Abroad in a Post-American World. The book was published in 2017 and was a finalist for the 2018 Pulitzer Prize in General nonfiction and the winner of the Overseas Press Club's Cornelius Ryan Award for Best Nonfiction Book on International Affairs. Susie, the podium is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Thank you to everyone for having me on this wonderful panel today, and especially to Zehra for organizing it and inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. I was so enjoying that talk about the specifics of Afghan politics and culture that I'm sorry I have to be the one to rip us out of that and talk about the Americans, but I think that's my role here on the panel today. So as you know, I'm a foreign correspondent who lived in Turkey for over a decade. I've traveled throughout the region. I've reported from Afghanistan, and I wrote a book about American foreign policy, and it was about the American people's relationship or lack of relationship to that foreign policy history and the many millions of people that foreign policy has affected over the last 70 years. So as the journalist on the panel, I probably have more questions than answers, and I'm eager to learn from all of you today. I already have a question for Professor Shahrani about how the American occupation might have affected these notions of citizenship or ideas of citizenship, but we can get to that maybe later. I watched along with everyone else the sudden reappearance of Afghanistan in the national and international news after a very long time of the war having been seemingly forgotten. It seemed that last August, as horrific as it was, might be an opportunity for the United States to finally reconsider the devastation of not only the war, but of the larger war on terror. There have been many times in the last years, in fact, as I have also seen the Americans finally reconsidering their domestic history, meaning the history of slavery and racial oppression, that I have wondered and maybe even expected that someday this attention to history would extend to the rest of the world, that we might engage in conversations about who America has been in the world, whether any of our ideals have been represented by our actions, meaning the actual reality, and who we might want to be in the future. I might have even hoped that the Democrats, who I think are now infused with a little more leadership from politicians critical of American power, could lead this kind of inquiry. I think, unfortunately, two things have happened. One, of course, was the rise of Donald Trump, which muddled a lot of things. Among the many unfortunate things that presidency brought, I do think it also made a lot of people in the United States believe that everything that was done before him was somehow better. And we heard a lot of this nostalgia about the liberal international order, as if it had not been one that consistently violated the United States' own stated principles and ideas, and as if a lot of those values hadn't been long before Trump ever came along. And yet again, the debacle of the withdrawal seemed that it might have prompted a lot of new questions. And I think we saw some, I mean, it was incredible how many articles were suddenly being published, how many questions were being asked. We saw a kind of rhetoric and language in the media that I don't think I had seen ever before. But tragically, and of course, there are many tragedies about what's happening in Ukraine, I think that the arrival of this new war this new crisis might have swept, it risks sweeping Afghanistan under the rug and what happened there forever. I work in the media and in book publishing, and I can tell you for sure that interest has waned in the mainstream world. So my question would be how to revive it, because I think only a full reconsideration of not only that war, but the war on terror, unless that is conducted, we will of course make the same horrific mistakes again. And I will just mention a few statistics. As we know, the war on terror shattered entire nations and economies. It rendered some 40 million people refugees. It killed at least 800,000 people and terrorized and abused many more. But it's not only that. It has completely, it was, I would say, a complete wholesale reimagining of a religion, of human rights, of citizenship rights, of the law and various legal structures, and also of security. I mean, I think that once you start really thinking about how enormous these 20 years have been, the impact that they have had, it's quite difficult to get your head around. It's not just Afghanistan and Iraq. I lived in Turkey for a long time. So many authoritarian leaders use this word terrorist to persecute their own citizens. This is happening everywhere from India to China to the Philippines, and certainly is happening in Turkey. The word terrorist, what does it mean anymore? I mean, language has been obliterated by this period. So I think that there's that to actually reckon with. But then, the statistics are one thing, but I think that the details are quite another. And this is where I do think that journalism serves a certain purpose. Some of the great books about Afghanistan, for example, And about the war on terror, it's one thing to know that so many people were unlawfully detained at Guantanamo Bay, for example. It's quite another thing to realize that at least one of them was tortured for 60 days straight. That is not just about the violation of laws, that is about a country that I think has been gripped by a mental illness. So I think that you know, the one thing that I am holding on to, and I do want to keep mentioning this, I've mentioned it in some things I've written, and I just wanted to bring it up today, is there was an article, I think, in Foreign Affairs by Bernie Sanders' foreign policy chief, Matt Duss, who I think is a brilliant guy. And he said what he was arguing for was a comprehensive review along the lines of the 9/11 Commission or the 2006 Iraq Study Group to explore the consequences of US anti-terrorism policies since 9/11, surveillance, detention, torture, extrajudicial killing, the use of manned and unmanned airstrikes, and partnerships with repressive regimes. And I do wonder if there is any chance of reviving such a thing in the future. Would not the United States have to undergo a process of really asking themselves, you know, it's not only about human rights and citizen rights, it goes even deeper. It's about war itself. And to some degree, and I know this will sound strange, but it's about death. Before they could even approach their principles at this point on human life and the rights we should all hold. So I think I have so many questions for you about, you know, I think we're only beginning to understand what are the long-term impacts of the occupation, not just in terms of obviously what has been done to the population, but these questions about citizenship. What kind of inherited ideas might the occupation have thrust on Afghanistan? Thank you.
Very good. Very good. Excellent timing, Susie. And thank you so much for sharing your valuable insights with us. Our next speaker is Professor Zahra Karabasakil Arad. She is a professor of political science at the University of Connecticut, studying human rights with an emphasis on women's rights. She has published numerous journal articles, book chapters, books, including Democracy and Human Rights in the Developing Countries. I precisely remember this book because late Samuel Huntington made several references to this book. And also a book on human rights worldwide and the uses and misuses of human rights. Zahra, podium is yours. Thank you.
Always forget that. Thank you, Mahmoud. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And thank you all, starting with our panelists and everybody in the audience for joining us today. I'm not an Afghan specialist, but I work on Islam and gender issues and development issues. So I'll kind of come from that end. And I will address women's rights and the role of the US regarding women's rights in Afghanistan. Now, when it comes to women's rights in Afghanistan, we have a tendency to consider only the last 2.5 decades and uphold a mythology that divides this really short history into two diametrically opposing eras. And the first era is the rule by the Taliban, who subscribe to a conservative notion of Islam, followed a very restrictive gender ideology, ended all opportunities for women, and excluded women from education and public life. Now, the second era is the period of the occupation by the US and its NATO allies. And in this, what I call mythological history, the US and its allies are seen as saviors. They restarted girls' schooling, created job opportunities for women, and instituted a constitution and political system that required women's participation. Women became members of the parliament, the cabinet, the judiciary, engaged in economy, and moved on a path toward which we may call a weakened patriarchy, if not gender equality. Now, these are not really wrong, but they're partial pictures. And when treated as full story, they distort the reality. These depictions pretty much describe the life in a few cities. And especially for Kabul, it's often mentioned that it was a window dressing. Now, rural women, who constitute nearly 80% of the female population in Afghanistan, had a different life. For them, the US and NATO were not saviors, but the cause of their main problems, the lack of safety, security, and livelihood. With the occupation, actually, women's and girls' living conditions in the countryside deteriorated. Their main concern became survival and safety of their families, as they were living under conditions of bombing, harassment, invasion of their homes by the US and Allied troops, displacement from their homes and villages, and even starvation. The extreme poverty led to an increase in the practice of selling girls for food or cash, sometimes as wives to older men, and as well as the practice of exchanging girls to settle feuds and repay debts. Kabul and other major cities were not completely safe, but the countryside was the real war zone. As thousands of civilian deaths caused by the US and its allies have been presented to us as collateral damage, the severe conditions endured by rural women have been dismissed as cost of war on terror, as Susie mentioned, if they were ever acknowledged. But the US engagement in Afghanistan did not start in 2001. Before the war on terror started, during the Cold War, there was the goal of containment of communism. We have to remember the United States' use of Islam as an alternative to communism and promotion of Islamization all around the Middle East and Muslim majority countries in Asia and Africa. It was carried out with the help of Saudi Arabia, which spread its brand of restrictive Islam called Wahhabism. In Afghanistan, the United States' contribution to the rise of Islamism was blended with militarism. In other words, the problems that the US created for women, and I would say for the country in general, did not start 20 years ago, but at least in the 1970s. Once a pro-Soviet government was established in Afghanistan, the CIA started to agitate against the Afghan government and supported the Mujahideen, the Muslim soldiers or warriors, which included the Taliban. In President Carter's National Security Advisor Brzezinski's own words, in quote, "The secret operation was an excellent idea. It had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap." So expectedly, the Soviet invasion came and more open and significant amount of military support was extended to the Mujahideen. Afghanistan was a pawn in this game and was drawn into a proxy war. After the Soviet withdrawal, the US supported other Mujahideen groups against the Taliban. Taliban's gender approach was not a concern of the US. The US was well aware that one of the reasons for the Mujahideen to resist the pro-Soviet government was the government's relatively progressive gender policies. Now, I really would like us to question if the gender approach and policies of another government that could have come out of the Mujahideen resistance struggle, including the Northern Alliance that the US supported against the Taliban government, would be much different. Because all Mujahideen groups have subscribed to the similar notions and patriarchal notions and claimed them to be Islamic. While Islamization is a process that works against women, its combination with militarization is devastating. Militarization works against women in many ways. First, it hypes up certain kinds of violent masculinities. Second, it channels resources from economic needs and social services to distraction. Third, it creates hardship for women in forms of sexual and other kinds of violence, as well as overburdening women who would try to compensate for the loss of income and services. A wide range of human rights of Afghan women has been violated by the United States through both acts of omission and acts of commission. If we apply Henry Schu's classification of 3 corollary duties, the United States failed on all 3 accounts. The first duty, and Schu's articulation, to avoid the deprivation of one's rights. Now, instead, the US caused the deprivation of women's and others' right to food, housing, physical integrity, health, healthcare, and others, and most important, the right to life. Second duty is to protect one from the deprivation of their rights. And instead of protecting Afghan citizens' rights from deprivation by other parties, the US enabled various violations by local leaders and warlords who were their allies. Finally, it failed to fulfill the duty of aiding the deprived. After 20 years of occupation, we see very little reconstruction. There has been no investment in rural infrastructure, no effort to develop the agricultural sector, no alternative to opium production. Even in Kabul, open sewages are reported to be running next to glamorous shopping centers. Now, by some accounts, the US left the place in a condition worse than what existed 20 years ago. Now, after the US withdrawal, the isolated country is going through another humanitarian crisis. So, the famous question, in Lenin's words, what is to be done? Now, I think there has to be a constructive engagement with the Taliban government. The US owes to the Afghan people, especially to Afghan women. First, the US has to return the $6 to $7 billion of Afghan money kept in the US to the central bank of Afghanistan. These frozen assets have to be released to stimulate the Afghan economy. Perhaps with some conditions, this can be done in installments. As the conditions are met, more can be released. Second, the US has to pay reparations for the lives it took and the havoc it had created. Third, the US should refrain from supporting any military group against the Taliban, including Northern Alliance that has reemerged as the National Resistance Front. Basically, the war is not the answer. Afghanistan cannot afford another one. Now, over the decades of crisis and difficult times, Afghan women have proved their resilience. They organized, networked, collaborated to run schools, health centers, hospitals, and try to provide for their families and neighborhoods, openly or secretly, depending on the circumstances. They did not hesitate to defy the rules imposed upon them. And now, this is the optimistic thing, that there are reports that they are doing so again. We just have to enable them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful, excellent timing, and very valuable insights. Our next speaker is Dr. Orzela Nemat Ashraf. She is a research associate at School of Oriental and African Studies. She specializes on ethnography, holding a PhD in development studies from School of Oriental and African Studies known as SOAS. She has an MS in development planning from University College London known as UCL. And also she is internationally known as an Afghan activist. Rosella, the podium is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Munshipuri. Good morning, good afternoon, good day, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel. And I'd like to extend my thanks to the American Political Science Association, the Human Rights Department, and particularly to Professor Zara Arat and Professor Munshipuri. I have followed the conversations and the remarks of the distinguished speakers before me. What I would like to focus my time, although I mean, if I look at my own background as a woman being active on the ground in Afghanistan for all of my life, I would say, from a very young age up until now, I would just spend the entire 10 minutes talking about women's rights. But I thought I will use this platform and this opportunity to share with you some personal thoughts and reflections also around the concept of human rights. Because we've heard about Afghanistan's general situation and the political system. We've heard about how the women's rights, the intervention were labeled as the intervention to quote unquote liberate the Afghan woman, and we've seen the result of that. So after years of being active on the ground as a defender of women's rights and human rights, what I'm learning in this process is that the actual concept of human rights is more, it has been historically more of a colonial, part of a colonial project. And we have seen that in Afghanistan. The way the discourse of human rights has been used, particularly in the last 20 years, is a very clear example of how a kind of a neo-colonial forms of intervention are making things part of this project and also excluding things out of this project. But interestingly, in the trajectory of the human rights discourse itself, although it has become part of the colonial project, it turned against the colonial itself, because once people started to know about the rights, they move against it to the rulers and try to ask for their rights. I think in the personal development of ourselves as Afghans born in the context of war and interventions, as mentioned and explained before, the war that has never been our own, the war that has been basically fought between the two superpowers back in the days 40 years ago, and still we are seeing the different forms and shapes and phases of these wars continuing. In this process, we've learned how to question and raise for our ask. And probably, again, I'm talking about someone who has been day and night active defending the rights of her people and her country. I've realized at this point that probably this was one reason that the international powers got fed up with us asking for our rights and just left us to the hand of the worse as we speak. So my own definition of the rights or human rights or understanding of human rights is these very fundamental and basic rights away from politics: the right to live, the right to live where you are born, at least, the right for protection and safety, the right for basic services, health, education, for God's sake, education, having access to education, the right for different jobs opportunities. And we see that at this day and age that we will live, there are forces in countries that are still supportive and protective of those who are basically denying half of the population from these rights. So that's something to really reflect upon. My own personal trajectory of living, being born in Afghanistan and living as a refugee for 11 years in Pakistan, and moving from there to basically become a grassroots level, a grassroots activists in the time of the living as a refugee in Pakistan. When I look at it back in different phases, we have been active, basically trying to raise the voice against the injustices, whether it was the time where we faced the injustices from those who were previously enforced and empowered by the invading forces or different global war that we were talking about. I mean, mostly the warlords in the Civil War period, 90s, or it was later on against the Taliban, who took control of the country and still were denying the basic rights of the people. In all these periods, working at different levels as an individual defender of rights, as a leader in the grassroots, later on as a researcher, one thing that became quite evident for me was that there is a very strong relationship between the discourse of human rights and the politics. And we've seen this, and there are examples of that. If we look deeper into the 20 years of Afghanistan from 2001 to 21, in this period, we have seen how politics, and by politics, I mean mostly the sort of the compromises, the sort of political dealings that have operated within the country among the Afghan politicians, and how they have systematically devalued the values of the core principles and values of human rights, and how the concept itself has been also played as a political card by the international actors. And the examples that Professor Zara was mentioning, I think, are the clear ones. And to this day, we are seeing the examples in a complete biased way, highlighting the crimes, highlighting the violations conducted by one party to the conflict, and not highlighting it about the other party is, I think, clearly an example or an evidence of the fact that the concept is completely politicized. For example, there is an international criminal court, ICC, based in The Hague, and we have seen how the Americans have actually reacted very strongly against the possibility of Afghanistan's case being investigated when it comes to the violations by the American army. In the same way, we have seen that for the last not only 20 years, 30 years, let's say, or even 40 years, there has been very little examples in Afghanistan, in the case of Afghanistan, to bring the prime violators of human rights, whether they are from the warlords or from the Taliban or from the governments. The 20 years governments also had champions of torture and human rights within the systems. None of them were brought to justice, neither at the national level nor at the international level. But at the same time, we have seen that, for example, from some African countries where the political relations with those particular countries and people have changed, they were brought to justice. They were brought to the International Criminal Court. So I think, although time is limited, but I wanted to highlight this political aspect of human rights and raise this question that the practical experience of Afghanistan, particularly in this regard, is showing something that has been hugely problematic, if not completely failed. I will have some reservation to declare the entire attempts of the intervention in Afghanistan as a complete failure. No, actually, we have seen some remarkable changes in the country. Look, we have to believe in people's agency. I have huge problems with a sort of a notion where Afghan people are treated as passive subjects, whether at the urban or rural or community or political or out of the political scenes. Everyone has an agency, and that agency managed to change the society in Afghanistan. And this change, we will see the evidence of this change as we move on. And one of the simple examples of that in the current context as we speak is that there is a very strong, in spite of the fact that everyone knows the level of harshness by the ruling regime in the country, people are reacting against their actions. And let me tell you, the reaction is not necessarily taking up arms and fighting them in the guns and on a war front. No, not accepting their restrictive rules is an example of resistance. And I think people in the level of invasion and occupation in Afghanistan has been unprecedented. I'm hoping that there are historians among us to remind us of any other example. But look, a country that has been systematically occupied and invaded, not simply in a military sense, but in a military sense, in an economic sense, in a cultural sense, not by one party, invaded or occupied by multiple parties at the same time. I looked at the local governance and my personal PhD research, and I find out that an Afghan typical village is a subject of interventions by countless actors. From the madrasas being funded by Najaf, for example, to madrasas being funded by Haqqaniya and other groups in Pakistan, Najaf, by the way, Iraq and Iran, to the American projects of World Bank, for example, funded projects about democratization, to military projects through PRT funded basically making allies. So look, one village receives all these resources and interventions with different agendas and conflicting agendas. So this whole different forms of intervention changed people. And so I think the time has come to really re-examine these notions, these concepts, such as human rights, such as democratization and what it really means, and also make a very honest account of what we really mean by these concepts when we try to communicate it in terms of their global understanding, and especially in context where, like Afghanistan, the nature of intervention is not solo, like there is no one line. There are so many actors with so many different agendas, conflicting agendas. And in that sense, having a new sort of revision of these concepts and their understandings probably will help us to see how we move forward. And lastly, I think probably my time is up, but just one additional part, when we talk about the failure on this part, I fully agree that there has been a complete failure when it comes to the defense of human rights values in Afghanistan. Look, one example that I see is as a failure is that today, anyone who has been labeled or named as a human rights defender can no longer feel safe and secure to live in Afghanistan. Is that what we were looking for? And there is a 40 million population left with no one monitoring or watching or raising their voice to defend the human rights. Why? Because our struggle was very one-sided. We ignored the bombings, we ignored the raids by the international military forces, but we raised our voice against the suicide attacks and the Taliban violations. So if we were all balanced enough as human rights defenders, maybe we would have not had to also pack and leave the country due to the horrifying situation that everyone experienced in August last year. So with that, I believe we definitely are in the time that we have to rethink all these forms of intervention, all these concepts, and reintroduce them in ways that everyone across the world have a genuine understanding of its meaning and feel related to it. An Afghan in my probably generation in my age would never connect to the values of human rights if they know that their rights are not equal to the rights of the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arzela, for this very moving and thought-provoking presentation. Our last speaker is Professor Elizabeth Betty Hansen. She is Professor Emerita of Political Science at the University of Connecticut, where she specializes in international relations and South Asia. She developed and coordinated a South Asian study committee and later an India studies program. Her research also includes foreign policy, communication, and media studies. Professor Hansen, podium is yours.
Thank you very much. And a hearty thanks to all those who've helped to produce this very important discussion that we're having. I am going to my topic, coming right at the end, is quite different from the others. I'm going to focus on a very specific aspect of this very complex subject. I'm going to focus on those Afghans whose lives were jeopardized by the US departure and who tried to find safety in the United States. So, as you know, the US in Afghanistan, while it was there, provided employment and opportunities for thousands of Afghans, directly and indirectly created an environment for many more opportunities and careers. But most of those jobs, if not all of them, involved increasing risk as the Taliban gained strength and became more widespread throughout Afghanistan. Because, of course, they associated, quite rightly, those jobs with foreign occupation. Now, I guess it shouldn't be surprising, but it is kind of surprising that so little effort went into, considering the length of the war, 20 years, that how little was done, how little thinking, how little action, how little planning was done thinking about those people whose lives we were putting at risk and what was going to happen when we left. Especially those who had worked for the US government and even those who helped US troops. So actually in 2009, fairly early on, there was some effort to create a special immigrant visa to bring to the United States those who had worked directly for the US government or a government contractor for a certain period of time. But in fact, the procedural difficulties for gaining one of those visas were formidable, and they increased over time. Forms, recommendations, multiple verifications from high-level officials, screening, interviews, and much more. And in the last 4 years of our last 4 years before our departure, new requirements were added. At the same time, new requirements were added, budgets and processing staff for processing those requirements were reduced. Multiple agencies were involved, and there was no coordinator, no coordination. Bureaucratic deficiencies and inefficiencies tremendously increased the amount of time involved in getting one of those visas and reduced the number of visas that were actually granted. In fact, it was estimated that the average wait time to get a visa was about 4 years, in spite of the fact that the congressional mandate was that every visa application should be decided within 9 months. So by the time President Biden made his speech on April the 14th, 2021, that it's time to end the forever war, there was a serious backlog of 17,000 immigrant visa applicants. And although President Biden's symbolic deadline for the end of the war was September the 11th, American troops began leaving shortly after that, the next month. And so essentially by early July, the bulk of the troops were out, except for those that were protecting the embassy and the airport. And at the same time that the US was deporting, of course, the Taliban spring offensive was beginning, the offensive that culminated in the final fall of the government and the takeover of Kabul. So meanwhile, George Packer, in an article in the March issue of the Atlantic Monthly, according to him, he says there were various groups, humanitarian groups, veterans groups, and even a group of bipartisan senators who pressed the administration for a mass evacuation to Guam of special immigrant visa applicants, and as well as other Afghans who were at risk because of their association with the United States. But apparently the administration's concern was that entering Guam, a US territory, would give the Afghans a legal right to asylum, even if they didn't pass security vettings. In addition, there were concerns about the political damage that might be incurred from having thousands of Afghans resettled in the US at the same time that historic numbers of Central Americans were flooding the southern border. There was also the problem of optics. A mass evacuation from Afghanistan would raise the specter of the Vietnam departure. It could provoke panic in the population and undermine confidence in the Afghan government. And in fact, in June, President Ghani came to the White House and specifically requested Biden to hold off on the evacuations, and President Biden agreed to that. So there were all those concerns about that approach. We don't know how it would have worked out, but it was something that wasn't even seriously contemplated. But even all those concerns, it does seem that there could have been a sort of quiet, gradual set of evacuations, either on commercial or military flights. Maybe 1,000 or so a week wouldn't have raised much of a ruckus, and it would have made a tremendous difference. And as the Taliban advanced, of course, more and more people applied for the special immigrant visa. And the problem with that was that that the Taliban, as they advanced, were setting up checkpoints everywhere. So anybody who was somewhere else besides Kabul had a very difficult time getting there when it was necessary to get there to obtain your visa, to obtain your special immigrant visa for interviews, etc. So, and of course, the number of applicants are also increasing as we see the Taliban advance. And that is what's come even more overwhelming what was already a very sluggish processing system. Well, there were warnings. On July the 13th, there was apparently a warning on a descent cable channel from the embassy in Kabul. And it warned that the Taliban were rapidly advancing and Kabul could fall within weeks. And it urged that there be some emergency evacuation of allies. But only a few with the special immigrant visas had managed to get a flight out before the fall of the government and the takeover of Kabul. So the chaos that ensued at the airport, which Dr. Numa referred to, the chaos that ensued at the airport on the weekend of August 14th and 15th was vividly portrayed in the media, although I'm afraid it's in the background of people's memories at the moment. But what that chaos at the airport represented was thousands of personal stories of mental and physical suffering, and for many, tragedy. George Packer's article attributes the difference between those who managed to get out and those who did not to three factors: the personal resourcefulness and determination, and connections, but most of all, sheer luck. So what about the lucky ones who were evacuated? Estimates of 67,000 to 85,000, depending on your counting method and the timing you use. Most were sent first to one of 10 foreign military bases in Europe, or the Middle East for vetting and processing. And then they were sent to one of 8 military bases in the US for more processing, for vaccinations, and for arrangements for resettlement. Amazingly, by February the 5th, that's only 5 months after the evacuation, the US government, working with refugee settlement agencies and other groups, managed to resettle more than 76,000 Afghans in 200 different communities throughout the United States. And this was in fact a remarkable achievement, especially considering the fact that only 60% of the refugee resettlement agencies, the established ones, were in place at the time due to President Trump's reduction in the number of refugees admitted. It was not much business for them, and especially for reduction in funding to those agencies. In fact, staff had been laid off, and some agencies had actually closed altogether. So there was a tremendous ramping up effort that was necessary. Now, although refugee agencies and humanitarian organizations and thousands of volunteers are helping at this point to ease this transition to normal lives, the status of these newly arrived Afghans in the US is in limbo. And that's because the majority were given a special parole status. And this status is used to meet emergency humanitarian needs. And it gives permission to stay in the United States for 18 months to 2 years without a visa. But the problem is that they can't apply for permanent residence in the United States, that is a green card, until they have actually got a legitimate presence here, which means they have to either apply now for a special immigrant visa if they're eligible, that is, if it worked for the government, or otherwise they have to apply for asylum. Either process is lengthy, arduous, and has a very uncertain outcome. There's a current backlog now, for example, of 400,000 asylum cases. So there's a good chance that the parole period can run out before they actually manage to get asylum, let alone a residence card. In a number of past situations, most notably after the Vietnam War, Congress passed adjustment acts that allowed individuals with parole status to apply directly for permanent residence after 2 years. So an Afghan Adjustment Act was in fact, a bill was introduced in May, a year ago in May, but there has been no action since then. So much uncertainty lies ahead for them. And of course, there are all those who were left behind, and those are those who still would like to come. And that seems even more uncertain.
Good. Thank you so much. Excellent timing. We have approximately 25 minutes for Q&A. And there are several questions. I don't know how much time we will have to actually answer these questions, but I have 3 questions from our audience that I'd like to present to you. If you feel that it is a question that you can address more generally, please do. Otherwise, I will address it to a specific person. First question is to Dr. Shahrani. There is a student at your school, a PhD candidate by the name of Suleiman Qiyamat, who's asking you this question. Professor Shahrani, how to bring the foreign players, both globally and regionally, also state and non-state actors to back a decentralized political system in Afghanistan?
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Qiyamat. I appreciate you engaging in this discussion. I think the first thing that we need is for the Afghans to come to some kind of agreement for a transformative change in the country from over-centralized, historically foreign-dependent, rented regimes to one that is popularly based, community supported, and based on the principle of community governance. This is the real challenge because some decentralization efforts have been, I think, abused and defamed, and like federalism. Federalism, mentioning the term has been a sort of criminal act. In fact, President Karzai once, from behind a microphone, claimed that anybody who talks about federalism is a, what is the term? A traitor at that level. So I think some changes are occurring. A few days ago, even Khalilzad in a conference at Islamabad was asking for decentralization is a way out of the Afghanistan sort of political problems. So maybe a lot of young people are now also agitating for community self-governance and also a decentralized regime. If we Afghans can have a consensus on this, or even a large number of us wants to, then we can seek the help of international community. But if we don't have some kind of agenda of our own, and this is really a serious problem in Afghanistan because of our dependency. Essentially, outsiders have found their proxies inside the country, and they're not allowing actually the Afghans to come together to have some kind of engaged discussion on what kind of nizam or political systems they have for the future, so that they can then take the initiative to ask, come and help us accomplish this. This lack of agenda, Afghan agenda, is, I think, the problem. If we wait for outsiders to do it for us, it will never come, because the last 140 years of history shows that outsiders are very, very happy with rented regimes at their disposal, and they need to only, and that's, again, a phenomenal thing, because in America, people want to focus on ideas, on values, on systems, on principles. But when they go to our part of the world, they just want to deal with individuals, with persons, not with ideas, not with institutions, not with anything. So that there is this conflictual sort of process that goes on. So my advice is for the Afghans to come together and have their own clear agenda for what kind of system could work for the country, and then seek help from outsiders, whether regional or global.
Thank you so much. There's a question addressed to Professor Zahra Arad. Professor Zahra, you talked about Islamization and the way that process actually works against women's and children's rights and so on and so forth. And then the question is addressed in this way. Professor, could you please explain Saudi's transnational influence with regard to spreading Wahhabism in Afghanistan and even beyond? Has it spread to parts of Africa as part of the Saudis' actions, or whether or not USA has played a role in terms of promoting that process?
That sounds like a doctoral thesis. I'll thank you. It's a great question that I'll just touch upon a few things. That is, I cannot delve into it much, but I think it is like this particular Saudi-US alliance working in the sense mostly facilitated with the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Shah, who was a staunch US ally, and in many we may say actually that an instrument of US foreign policy in the region. Once he was out of the picture, then the United States mainly start to rely upon the Saudi regime. And here it is important, it is like if we pay attention, it's like then with that we also see, since Khomeini government was the kind of like represented Shiite Islam, we also see support for Sunnite Islam coming from the Saudi way. And so the types of alliances and so on, it's really complicated. And I have to confess that I'm not on top of that, but the use of petrodollars was in place, and then the strategies could be, say, from soft diplomacy to actually supporting militant groups who were eager Islamists who would like to force their belief on others. But on the soft side, the Saudi embassies offering Quran classes would be kind of like one form, and socializing people into in subtle ways that to sponsoring some Muslim groups, NGOs, and so that would offer social services, soup kitchens, and other kinds of things that in impoverished communities, which were much needed but not supported by their own governments. So it was layered, then we can say, and then it actually goes out. Turkey, for example, which was kind of subject to this kind of intervention or policies followed before with the rise of the AKP government, and so now the Turkey is playing similar roles in other parts of the world, including Africa, using this kind of soft diplomacy and aid, and so to kind of have people that are supportive of their understanding of, again, Islam and mentality, and establish alliances. So that's I can say in this short time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There is a question for for Dr. Orzela, but I wanted to engage Susie for a moment. Susie, you talk about mental state of people in Afghanistan. And, you talk about traumatized people. How can outside players, NGOs, non-governmental players, Red Cross, Amnesty International, Human Rights, how can they help these traumatized people because of your experience on the ground? If you can briefly speak to that.
Well, I didn't specifically work on that. And when I went to Afghanistan, it was a whole other phase of the war. But I can say that, for example, just based on my experience in even Turkey, where there are 4 million Syrian refugees living there, Turkey, which has a very robust humanitarian aid program, and in the beginning at least, was doing quite a lot for Syrian refugees. I remember meeting a woman who said that I'm the only person in Turkey who has specifically studied trauma. She was a psychologist, and that was her specialty. And she said that there isn't the infrastructure for sort of trauma psychology or those sort of rehabilitative practices in a place like Turkey that is incredibly advanced and everything else. And so there was maybe one organization that was founded around specifically trauma, and that was it. So the resources in a place like Turkey for something like that were very minimal. And so, you know, when you're asking about what can be done about trauma and mental health, I mean, I feel as though this is also kind of, I mean, I'm thinking about the Syrian example a lot because I remember talking to Syrian friends and talking about people who were talking about their Syrian refugee friends and what they were going through in the pandemic. And I think that and a lot of them are living in Europe. And I think that their response was, I've been through a civil war. What is dealing with a pandemic? I mean, I have been in a state of survival for the last 15 years. And I would imagine that the conditions of people in Afghanistan, the level of trauma, considering especially what Dr. Naimat was talking about in terms of the many, many decades of occupation and the many decades of war, we're talking about a kind of complex trauma that I can't even begin to understand. I think that what I would hope is for these refugees, I mean, first, we hope that there would be more countries taking in more refugees, but that there would be those kinds of services in place to understand that, I mean, it's funny because trauma has become this subject in the US that's very popular, but where everybody is, you know, talking about whether or not they have PTSD or some kind of trauma and how that affects. But I mean, have we even begun to consider what a society goes through on such a large scale like Afghanistan or Syria? I think that we would have to be privileging that problem with a lot more resources, and I'm not sure that we do. I mean, you all, the rest of you all may know.
Thank you so much. Very perceptive and timely response. Professor Naimat, the gentleman by the name of Mohammed Bel Halal from University of Sidi, Mohammed ibn Abdullah from Morocco, has a question. I think I would also invite Dr. Nazif to jump in if he wishes to do so. The question is a long question. I'll give you the short version of that. The question is that the problem is delay in state building in Afghanistan and building some democratic institutions due in large part to the periods of the war and delay in economic development, which Mr. Belhalal says it really prevented the progress in educational achievements and also the emergence of civil society, free press, and also responsible elite. What is your response to the questions of state building in Afghanistan, which was kind of delayed and was interfered with by external actors?
Thank you, Professor Monshipur. In my opinion, and I'm sure, you know, of course, this is a big debate in the academia in general, the state building is not, should not necessarily, but by state building, mean building local institutions. It's not a project, a very sort of a mechanical process or a project that can happen as a result of direct intervention, whether economic, political, or military. What we have seen over the past 2 decades, under the name of state building, there were multiple forms of intervention. And last August was a naked example that this is not working. So what happened to the state that was being built? And there are so many projects I can think and name here that were basically funded under the title of building local institutions, building state institutions, so forth. Yes, we have created something in the state. The technical aspects of the state still functions in Afghanistan in the presence of Taliban. We are in early stages. If this continues, we are in a very dangerous path. But at the moment, as we speak, there are institutions, there are technical people still leading. The top leadership has changed and the Taliban have taken over. The Taliban approaches to state building is very different from what we have seen before. It's the delaying of state building is something that is directly linked to the scale of the external intervention. If by what Professor Shahrani said, if Afghans for once come together and have the opportunity to come together, I mean, let me also be on the defense of my people and say, look, show me one name of an independent democratic thinker in Afghanistan who survived. and raised and survived. Remember the 1980s and the slaughtering of the Afghan intellectuals in Pakistan and disappearance of them. And anyone who raised their voice as an independent person was taken out by different forces in the country. So when you are in that level, under surveillance, under pressure, it becomes very difficult. But eventually, I believe that the newer generation of Afghanistan, the ones who were brought up and grown up over the last 2 decades with lots of privileges within the rural and urban societies, I would say, we will see eventually this will happen, that there will be much more internal struggle within the country, not accepting the outsiders' agenda, whether it is the extreme level of Islamic fundamentalism, we call it, or if it was an extreme level of any other form of intervention, it will not make. I mean, this country's history is showing us one thing, that outside intervention may survive for a decade or two, but cannot survive forever. Whatever it is, it will not let people do that. So, I mean, we have to be careful about, talking about state formation, I think is what we will expect to see. And in that sense, what I mean is that internal growth of building local institutions. And just to follow up on conversation by Professor Shahrani, I think when we talk about the self-governance system, my personal understanding of Afghanistan is that we have a powerful system of local governance existing beyond the formal system. So the formal system of governance in Afghanistan ends in districts. But look, we have 400 districts, we have 37,000 villages. The villages are ruled by people excellently. They have their own leadership, they have their own management. Yes, they're parallel because they were never left to be on their own and move from that bottom up to further. That connection has never been made because the district level and up has always been subject to the rentier system that we were talking about, funded by the external sources, whether it was during the British Empire or before and even after. It has been a project ongoing forever. So that notion of self-governance is quite powerful within the country. And as a result, even we are now seeing that fighting. If I hope I don't take longer, when we noticed that as soon as the Taliban arrived and they stopped the girls' education in general, if you remember, there were 7 to 10 provinces. I repeat, we have 34 provinces. 7 to 10 provinces managed their own way to negotiate locally with Taliban and allowing girls to go to high school. It changed after the 23rd of March because there is this fight with the Taliban showing that we have authority and that has to be operationalized across the country. But up to the 23rd, there was a period where 7 to 10 provinces made it to the point, thanks to the resistance of the local population and thanks to their struggle to negotiate with local Taliban leaders and say, look, we take care of everything you are concerned about, allow our girls to get to go to school. To me, that's what we are seeing. And maybe in a context of less outside intervention, we will see the opportunity of this growth. That's very much subject. By the way, when I talk about intervention, it's not only the American intervention or the Western. I mentioned earlier that we talk about it in all different ways of local, regional, different groups, different parties, from the drug, the legitimate or the illegitimate or the illegal forms of actors who are also trying to benefit out of this or fish out of this muddy water, as we say it. So that has to be noted. Thanks.
Great thought. Thank you so much. Before I give Dr. Shahrani a chance to ask a question from Zahra, apparently, I want to engage Professor Betty. Let me just engage Professor Betty Hansen for a while. Professor Hansen, I'm sure you're familiar with Obama's interview with Jeffrey Goldberg, in which Obama clearly said, President Obama said, she said, look, Middle East is not as significant as it used to be, and it has become a morass. He used the word quagmire, morass. I think the idea of withdrawal from Middle East, gradual withdrawal from Middle East, has been in the works for a long time. So why do you think that the US withdrawal from Afghanistan was premature?
Oh, I don't think it was premature. I was only trying to discuss the U.S. responsibility that it was incurring by simply being there and putting at risk so many people in Afghanistan. Once we had done that, then I intended to raise the question of, well, how do you deal with that kind of responsibility? And I also wanted to make it clear how we did, or rather did not, deal with that responsibility in timely fashion. No, I would not say that it was an untimely departure. It was just, what was untimely was any kind of plan for what would happen after we did depart.
Shahrani, the podium is yours if you want to ask a question from Professor Zahra.
Thank you. I'm going to ask my question to sort of piggy it back with a comment I wanted to make about the question that Mr. Bin Halal from Morocco had posed, and
Yes.
Dr. Nemat responded. I would like to say that, yes, the role of states in contemporary period anyways, critical for either poverty or prosperity of any society. And I think the book by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, Why Nations Fail, has a powerful thesis that it's not natural resources presence or absence in a society that makes a country rich or poor. It's a choice of a governance system, and whether it's inclusive or whether it's exclusive and extractive. In cases where the states are extractive and exclusive, they produce poverty. And in cases where political systems are inclusive and open access, they are likely to produce lots of prosperity and wealth. And the example of Britain, for example, with Egypt, comparing the two as they do, is very instructive. What kind of natural resources is there in England that made it the world's most prosperous society for centuries? And what about how does that compare with Egypt? A civilization that goes 3,000 years, and so much wealth produced and so forth. So it is really the 1668 Great Revolution in UK, which allowed the political system essentially to become decentralized. The monarchy was there, but symbol managed, but allowed private property ownership and so forth, and inclusive government, a constitutional monarchy, which made it rule the world. And Egypt has never had anything but outside colonial sorts of regimes and so forth that has made a very naturally very wealthy country very, very poor. And that goes for around the world.
Very good. Thank you. We have to end it there because
just if you allow me to pose my question. One of the things that they're saying from transformative change is also that we have to engage in constructive destruction of existing political systems in order to be able to have constructive programming. So I wanted to ask Professor Arad, if we have to engage unconditionally with the Taliban at this point, what kind of transformative change is likely, especially if there is need for constructive destruction? You have to destroy certain things constructively and replace them with something else that is positive, that is, that can bring about positive change. So what is your suggestion? What needs to be done with Taliban to engage with them? And just engage with them because they are there and they want to do the way they have been behaving for the last 8 months, and of course 4 years before that? Or is there some other condition that you want to tell the world that the Taliban must meet before they should be supported or helped?
Professor Arad, keep your remarks short because we are over time, please. Thank you.
Okay. question is so how do I make it short? I would actually reverse the question. That is the so if you go by destruction of Taliban, where would that get us? And I am less idealistic at this point. When the US left, what did it expect? Of course, the Taliban would come. Of course, it would establish its governance. And it is lofty to say we are not recognizing it, but what is the alternative? And so I go by ruling out the other alternatives, which is basically in a short sentence, like no more war. And I am actually, when I say these, when I gave my kind of 3 things to be done, I don't believe the US is going to do those, because it has to require a mental shift and so. But instead of looking at the whole problem in terms of what is interest in the US, what is in the interest of the Afghan people, then we have to kind of swallow the pride and say, okay, legitimate or not, but this is the reality. There's a government here. If we are not engaged with it, we cannot reach the Afghan people at all. And so there can be, again, some of the things that what is the power left in the US if it wants to use it in favor of the Afghan people? It's only economic at this point, I would say. Military one is proven to be not working. So it can use that, in my opinion, to not, and ultimately that is like none of the things that is sort of state building and resolving all of the problems and so on, but to address some basic rights.
Very good.
Thank
Thank you so much.
May I insert just?
I don't know what the time we have. You know, we are like 3 minutes over time.
Actually, I would like to hear if you'll have another minute that the Dr. Shahrani's own solution.
Yeah,
Please.
you see, in the last 20 years when Taliban were engaged in a war, nobody said war is enough, stop the Taliban war. If Taliban had not actually been fighting as much as they did, I think that old regime could have been made to act better. It's just because of what they were doing, people could not even demonstrate on the streets safely to tell the regime that what you're doing is unacceptable. And now that Taliban the terrorist regime has taken over the country, everybody says, well, no more war. I mean, come on. How can you tolerate a utterly terroristic regime pursuing still its agenda, terrorizing people in the name of a state? And we need to say, yes, no more war against them? I just don't understand that.
You want to briefly respond to that, Sarah?
I think I have expressed my views, and it would be just going back to 20 years back. That is what did the US achieve within 20 years? And if you go back to the same path, then we will have another 20 years of the same. Yeah. So, or maybe 50. I express my opinion about the problems with militarization and what is done by the US during those fighting years. I rest my case.
Very good. Very good. Thank you so much. Such a true pleasure to be in the presence of such an illustrious group of scholars and experts on the subject. I cannot thank you enough. This has been a very, very productive and a very informative, highly suggestive educational sessions. God bless. I wish you well. Once again, thank you for the APSA folks who helped us to put this seminar together, this webinar together. And I'm sure that we can share these recorded sessions with lots of people who are interested in the subject. I wish you a wonderful day ahead Thank you for your time and effort, and you made it possible. Zahra, God bless you to put this panel together. And I'm sure that the results were so wonderful that it really had or your efforts panned out. And the dividends of this conference are, reaching out to a lot of people. Thank you so much. Wishing you
And
well.
thank you,
It has been a pleasure.
Mahmoud,
Please
and
stay.
thank you,
Please stay in
everybody.
touch.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.